Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for August 17th, 2022. I think you'll see that a review of the past day's events makes very clear that the world is heading into a transitional mode where there's either going to be a continuing descent into a new dark age if the existing government's policies are carried out, that is, the existing Western government's policies are pursued, or a break from the unipolar world into a potential for a world in which all sovereign nations are able to participate in discussions about their mutual benefit through cooperation and economic development. Now, there are indications that outside of the transatlantic world, governments are moving in this direction, and we can see this as a potential unstoppable force. And this is a rejection of the so-called rules-based order, which is an enforcement of the policies of the global banking cartels, the financial cartels, and so on. We're moving into a transition away from a unipolar world. Now, I want to begin by giving you some quotes from a speech made at the Moscow Conference on International Security by Russia President Putin. Now, I know some of you think that when I quote Putin, it proves that I'm a mouthpiece for Putin, that I'm a Putin apologist or a Russian puppet. Well, it just shows how ignorant some people are. If you don't want to listen to what he's saying, how do you know he's so bad? What are you afraid of? Why are you afraid of a debate? We see the same thing with the FBI attacks on Donald Trump. Instead of taking on a debate, there's an attempt to silence, to censor, to promote a lying narrative and not allowing anyone to see outside of that. So I'm going to give you some quotes from what Putin said, and if you don't agree with him, fine. But it's important to know what he's saying because he does represent a significant factor in the world whose position is gaining increasing support from governments throughout, especially the global South. Here's what he said. The situation in the world is changing dynamically, and the outlines of a multipolar world order are taking shape. An increasing number of countries and people are choosing a path of free and sovereign development based on their own distinct identity, tradition, and values. Putin goes on to say, these objective processes are being opposed by the Western globalist elites who provoke chaos, fanning long-standing and new conflicts, and pursuing the so-called containment policy, which in fact amounts to the subversion of any alternative sovereign development options. Thus, he goes on to say, they are doing all they can to keep hold onto the hegemony and power that are slipping from their hands. They are attempting to retain countries and peoples in the grip of what is essentially a neo-colonial order. Their hegemony means stagnation for the rest of the world and for the entire civilization. Then he goes on to talk about what the United States is doing. And he said, quote, the United States and its vassals grossly interfere in the internal affairs of sovereign states by staging provocations, organizing coups, or inciting civil wars. By threats, blackmail, and pressure, they are trying to force independent states to submit to their will and follow rules that are alien to them. This is being done with just one aim in view, which is to preserve their domination. And he goes on to talk about Ukraine, saying the situation in Ukraine demonstrates that the U.S. is trying to prolong this conflict, that the policy that they're pursuing is to use the Ukrainians as cannon fodder. And he goes on and says a little bit more about that. Now, again, what you can do with this is whatever you want, but it's important that you know what Putin is saying. This was backed up by a statement issued by the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C., which said that the U.S. is acting with no regard to other countries' security and interests and creating a danger of a, quote, unpredictable escalation and a direct military clash of nuclear powers, unquote. This was in reference both to Ukraine and the Pelosi and other congressional visits to Taiwan. Now, an example of this is the Ukraine military shelling of the nuclear plant at Zaporozhye, which is now admitted to by the Zelensky government. That is, they're not even saying that it's the Russians who are doing it. They're admitting they're doing it, but they're blaming it on Putin for having soldiers in the plant. Well, they're trying to protect the plant. Now, this action was described by Scott Ritter, who's a former UN arms inspector, as, quote, a horrific war crime and an act of insanity, unquote. This is nuclear terrorism being conducted by Zelensky. Where is the protest from Western governments to this act, this rash act of craziness? Now, further, in terms of the shift to a new era, we see an open challenge emerging to the green agenda. Now, we at the Schiller Institute have long put the story out that the real issue is not man-made global warming, because there's always been periods of warming and cooling that have little to do with man's activity. That just a fraction of that, of the so-called warming or cooling, has to do with man's activity and has much more to do with solar radiation and the position of the Earth and our solar system in the broader galaxy. But instead, the climate emergency is being used to create the need for a Malthusian reduction of population. And that argument is behind the green agenda. Now, the open challenge includes scientists in Italy who, in the context of the coming election, have issued a challenge to debate the issue, open public debate. They previously issued a statement titled, "There is no climate emergency," which was signed by more than 1,200 scientists and scholars. This disproves the claim that the debate over climate change is over. They attack especially the shift from efficient energy sources, such as fossil fuels, nuclear, and coal, to inadequate and inefficient sources, such as solar and wind, which put us on the verge of an extremely hazardous situation this winter in Europe, where the cold weather will be met with blackouts and overpriced electricity if it is available at all. Now, also on the opposition to the green agenda, farmers are on the march from Iowa, where there's opposition to the new Inflation Reduction Act of the Biden administration, which passed by the narrowest of margins, but which is largely a push for green policies disguised as an economic Inflation Reduction Act. It's not addressing at all the cause of inflation, which is the Federal Reserve pumping of money into the hands of speculators, and instead is an attempt to destroy what's left of the independence of the American family farmer. And farmers are up in arms over this in the United States. In Bonn, Germany, on Monday, a convoy of 400 tractors surrounded the Federal Ministry of Agriculture there to protest the European Union climate policy. This is a policy which is threatening to shut down upwards of 30% of the farms in Europe, which are some of the most productive farms on the planet. At a time of food scarcity, how can you push a policy which reduces food production? And farmers are on the move. The Germans have announced their solidarity with Dutch farmers. There will be a national rally of farmers in Berlin on August 26th. And they're saying this will begin a 365-day protest until the green policy is dropped. We also see African nations rejecting the Green New Deal, and we can have more on that in the next couple of days. But most significantly, we had the South African foreign minister reject Secretary of State Blinken's efforts to bully them into accepting Western policy. Now, finally, let's look at the Justice Department FBI raid on the home of Donald Trump. What this reflects is not something about Donald Trump. It reflects a fear of the American people who were attracted to Trump precisely because he challenged the narrative of the financial and political elites in the United States. Whether you agree or disagree with Trump, whether you support everything he says or not, what's going on is an attempt to prevent the American people from having an opportunity to decide what to do. take away their opportunity to vote for a candidate, and instead hit that candidate with censorship, media lies, and judicial fascism to silence opposition. This is what was done to Lyndon LaRouche over many years. Instead of allowing a natural debate to occur where views can be presented by both sides and people can make their choices as opposed to having them forced down their throat by media narrative and by the censorship and social media and so on. Instead of that, they're attempting to limit who can speak, who can be heard, and what is allowed to be said. Now, on a positive note, Liz Cheney, the daughter of one of the princes of darkness, one of the children of Satan, Dick Cheney, who became the darling of Democrats when she joined the witch hunt around January 6th, she was crushed in her primary election in Wyoming yesterday. So this is the herald of change. We can see it happening worldwide. Join us at the Schiller Institute so that we can have an open debate and people can make their own decisions. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again tomorrow.